Hey there, as this is the rest day of the candidates, I've decided to share with you a lazy repertoire against the French defense. One thing you'll notice with the French defense, it will often lead to closed pawn structures, such as after the move e5, and black will obviously try to get some quite fast pressure against the white center. And also in some other lines, you'll often see, for example, after knight c3, knight f6, e5 and knight fd7, that once again we get a much more close kind of center. So you might be wondering, well, what's a way in which we can try to get a more open sort of position, but where we can still set some problems for the opponent? Now, a recent solution in the candidates is that players were often playing the move ed5 and just playing the exchange French, but this can also be a bit of a quiet and sort of lazy way to play that maybe is not going to be the best for your development as a player. I've also played the move knight d2, the Tarrasch a fair bit, where you try to get in e5 in a better version. But the move c5 is nowadays considered to be a pretty reliable equalizer, just taking advantage of the fact that the knight is maybe not ideally placed to defend the pawn. So the solution I'll present to you in today's training video is based on playing the main line of knight c3, but playing a few different shortcuts as such. Now, the main line here is the move bishop b4, the Winawer. Although in the Elite Chess database, you're probably going to face the move knight f6 the most often. And in my own games on chess.com, I actually face the Rubenstein with d takes e4, getting that more open center. Sort of the most often of all in my own games, where you just end up getting this extra space advantage to work with as such. If you're enjoying this video, by the way, do make sure to leave a like and to consider subscribing. Before I get into this, a few quick alternatives. If black does play a move like knight c6, for example, there are quite a few good replies you could go for here. I mean, even something like ed5 and bishop b5 gives you a little bit of an initiative with the extra tempo. But if you don't mind playing a more closed position, you can also play something like e5 here, knight e4 and bishop d3. And you can also just play the main line like this, where you give up the bishop pair, but you do get a nice space advantage in return. So it's up to you which one you want to go for, whether you want a more unbalanced position or you just want to play for two results and not really risk anything here as white. If they do play some move like c5, it's something that you're going to see quite a bit at low levels of play especially, but it's not a particularly good move, as after bishop to b5, knight c6, you can even play the move d takes c5 and just threaten the pawn on d5 as such. Of course, bishop c5 and queen d5 does just win a pawn here as white, with a winning advantage. But if black plays bishop e6 instead, we can just play bishop e3 and hang on to the pawn for a very clear advantage. My mouse is going a bit crazy today, but yeah, we're getting there in the end. So having looked at those alternatives, let's get into some more of the main lines. And I'm going to start with bishop b4 because, like I said, it's the most common line at the top level, but you'll probably see it a little bit less at your level of play, considering that most of your watchers are probably rated 1600 or below. So rather than going for the main line of e5 and playing these more closed positions that even the late Bobby Fischer, former world champion, often struggled to get his head around these sorts of positions, I'm going to suggest a simpler solution known as the Alekhine system with knight g2. And yeah, you are sacrificing a pawn here after d takes e4. If they don't play d4, you're probably just going to play e5, like for example, knight f6, e5, and you just kind of make the point you sort of have a better version of the Steinitz French, where you can just go like bishop e3 and just develop in a pretty natural manner. I think it shouldn't be anything too complicated for you guys, but yeah, in the game, black would normally play d4. We play to move a3, and the point of playing a3 is that now we can take back on c3 with the knight. If black does play bishop e7, of course you get your pawn back. Or you get a Rubenstein where maybe your knight's not absolutely ideal on e2. But on the other hand, you also gain this move ea3 in return, and you can either play queen d3 and castle long and just have a good pawn storm when they castle short, or you can play it a similar way with knight f6 and bishop e3 and once again queen d2, long castles, and charge your pawns at their king. And that'll give you a nice attacking position with a 50% win rate, which comes to a 54% score for white in the Elite Chess database. So a pretty decent outcome for us. Now if they do try to hang on to the pawn, Here, black actually has to be a little bit precise, where the moves he most often plays on lichess are not necessarily the best ones. The move that black really should play here is the move knight c6, attacking our pawn on d4. As knight f6, bishop g5 just makes it very easy for us to get the pawn back, making use of the pin. And if black plays f5 instead, trying to hang on to the pawn at all costs, even just some natural development would be quite adequate here as white. But you can also play queen g h5, and if you really want to try and punish the opponent, you can play it this way, where you weaken the black dark squares and you actually sacrifice the second pawn. It's a little bit of a trap if they take it. You can actually go knight to b5, and say if they play queen to g7, you're trying to meet bishop f4 with e5 or something to, defend the pawn on c7. The problem with that is we now have the move queen to c3. You're going to want to remember the move queen c3, because otherwise the position is going to be pretty bad for white. But once you remember, it all kind of just flows together. Like, you might be down 2 pawns, but already you're threatening to play bishop takes e5 and have knight c7 at the end to win the exchange. But I can't really avoid that, so you just end up having a really, really strong position here, with the black king stuck in the center. A bit of a long line, but definitely this is the one you probably will want to remember, especially in the Winawer. Now, if they play knight c6 and try to put pressure on your d5 pawn like this, there are a few reasonable replies, but the one I'm going to recommend here is for the move d5, where we basically are just playing for 2 results. We're very happy if they trade and we get the, very heavy pressure against the c7 pawn as such. So they really should play the move bishop e6. We take back our pawn. And optically speaking, we're a little bit better because we have the bishop pair advantage on open board. Now, if black does play precisely, they can try to neutralize it, but for example, if they let us go bishop d2 and long castles, that will give us a small advantage here, with white scoring especially well in the lichess database. So queen d4 is really a better trying to disrupt white's setup, but even then we can still play like bishop b5, queen a4, take, just keeping the tension so that, our bishop sort of takes back with her capture, rather than helping black just to develop his knight actively, as it were. So bishop b5 take, and if you take a position like this one with takes, and bishop b3, it's a very safe play for 2 results position. Your pawn structure is a bit better than black's. It's pretty easy just to steadily build up the position, and yeah, if black plays correctly, he'll draw, but there's not really any risk that we lose the game here. So that's what we mean by play for 2 results, an old Soviet way of talking about chess. Let's now look at a couple of the alternatives. Let's go with the move d takes e4 next, because after knight e4, black does have a few moves that they can choose between here, where the one you'll face most often online is going to be the move knight f6, but we're happy just to take and play knight to f3, and they really should play the move h6, because if they don't play h6, what will often happen is the queen will just be lost, and this is something that a queen trap that I've caught out a lot of players with in online blitz and bullet. h6 of course avoids that, but we can still be a little bit tricky here. We're not forced to just castle, but we can flick in the move queen to e2, with the point that black does now castle without thinking, which is what a lot of your opponents are going to do. We play the move queen to e4, threatening a checkmate on h7. They can't really block with a pawn, because then the h6 pawn is on pre, but if queen h5, we can then go queen h4. I think I might have covered this in my winning opening traps course from a few years back, but yeah, basically you are gonna sack on h6, and if they take you basically just give checkmate with queen h7, knight g5, this sort of thing. Not too much more to see there, let's say. Now, if black plays a bit more solidly with knight d7 to prepare the move knight f6 so they can take back with the knight, there's many good options here. Like, you can really make a pick of almost any move here and you'll be okay as white, because really the idea of the Rubenstein is more to equalize than to put pressure on white. But given that c5 is black's main plan to try and hold back our pawn on d4 and trade off our space, there is a certain logic to playing bishop e3 to cover that. And if they do play bishop e7, you can just go bishop d3, long castle, and you're just going to throw the pawns at their king and have a pretty easy attacking setup. Also, the e5 square is a really nice square beckoning for our knight, where it's sort of almost like a semi-outpost, because it's kind of hard for them to kick it away without really weakening their king position, as it were. So it's a pretty good practical system that players like Wesley So have played in the past, for example. And it's not something you'll face very often, but if they do play bishop d7, then one practical approach can just be to play c4 and just play it like a queen's gambit, where, black would probably wish that he could play c5 and put the knight on c6, which of course with a bishop on c6 not so ideal. It might not be the top line of the engine, but I think it's a quite nice practical weapon to get black something into a different position than you might expect. Finally, if they do play knight f6, this is our main line of sorts. Like I said, black's usually fairly happy to enter the positions with e5, knight fd7. So well, that's why I would probably recommend for players going for the grandmaster title or who are also grandmasters. I think for most other players, probably to move bishop g5 will be kind of an easier system to learn. It's certainly the system that I started with in 2010 on the suggestion of my trainer at the time, Grandmaster Ian Rogers. And here black has a little bit of a choice where, granted, you're not always going to be able to avoid a close position. Like, for example, if they play bishop e7, then yeah, you probably should play to move e5. Even if ed5 is not an outright mistake, if you're just wanting to, avoid fury and just get a sort of easy attacking setup like this, then sure. It's not the best line to play, but it's not terrible either. But if you're a little bit more of an advanced player, I think it is worth it to look into systems like e5 and the Alekhine Chatard attack with h4, which the Indians actually really like for white. Like, if you're able to go queen g4, bishop d3, you just get a really strong attack. And if they do take the pawn with, like, takes and takes, you have a few different ways you can play the attack. You can play, like, knight h3 and put the knight on f4 or the queen on g4 and just get a really strong attack this way. Like, knight g5. And even though you're down a pawn, you've got some really easy ways to open the king side with g4, long castles. Sometimes you can even play knight b5 at a good moment. Like, for example, c5 is already a big mistake here, like knight b5, and you can sort of see all it takes is black be careless for one move against these sort of gambits, and you can easily end up in a losing position as such. Of course, there are other ways that black can play it, but this sort of gives an idea of the overall flow of white attack, like queen g4, bring the knight in, castle, this sort of thing. And if they play a move like the McCutcheon with bishop b4, the main line with e5 is considered fairly promising for white by modern theory. We can just retreat the bishop in various ways for a small edge. But here, because it's a lazy repertoire, I'm going to suggest this shortcut of knight e2 as a way to get kind of similar play to what we saw in the Winawer system, where you might not be getting an advantage here, objectively speaking, but the position's quite easy to play. You go like queen d3, long castle, charge the pawns, and it's pretty understandable what white's going for in this sort of position, let's say. Whereas the lines with e5 require a little bit more strategic depth. Finally, probably the worst case scenario here is white is if they play d4 and play the burn system with bishop e7. Here the main line's bishop f6, and that can lead to a few different types of positions. But if you do want a lazy shortcut, the move knight f6 is not a considerably worse move. You can still play knight f3. Like, there are actually some modern ideas where you can even sometimes play queen d3 and long castles and still go for a kind of interesting attacking position like this, where you're going to, in many cases, be like pushing your h pawn and g pawns forward and you're getting some reasonable attacking chances. And it turns out even the endgame is actually not so bad for you either. Like, you can sort of use the fact that their bishop and knight are a little bit stuck, so you can kind of get your bishop to a long diagonal. The knight can come into d6, and you can say it's definitely a much easier position for white at this point. So yeah, this obviously wasn't meant to be an exhaustive analysis, but I think that this gives you certainly enough ideas to start playing knight c3 in your own games. I know that it's a move that a lot of people who play e4 want to play it, but just feel overwhelmed by the large body of theory. So it's kind of just a way to reduce that theoretical workload and start playing the system with some tricky practical weapons that make our life easy and make the opponent's life a bit more difficult. Do let me know in the comments below, what is sort of your favorite variation that we saw here. Was it the Alekhine Chatard attack? Was it the Alekhine Gambit? Or was it something else? Let me know in the comments below. And, if you do enjoy my coaching style and you are interested in having some private lessons, we can have some more like personal interaction and get really specific on, what are sort of the weaknesses holding you back in your games and help you specifically develop the thinking techniques that will get you to your next level in chess, then feel free to reach out to me via email or via Messenger. I've just put the links to those to access to reach out to me in the comments below. But yeah, whatever the case may be, I will see you guys in due course, whether it's in the next video or in the comments or via personal message, whatever works for you. But in any case, I'll see you in the next one and take care.